Це 10.
It's March 10, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation, and we start our panel discussion on how the Chinese factor can influence the Russian-Ukrainian war. We will talk to the following experts: Natalya Plaksienko-Butyrska, expert on East Asia, master in international relations, and Oleksandr Khara, foreign affairs and security policy expert at Center for Defense Strategies, diplomat advisor to the Defense Minister of Ukraine in 2020. We will have a couple of guests joining us online. Yuriy Poita, head of Asia Pacific section at the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies, and Dmytro Yefremov, expert of the Ukrainian Association of Sinologists, research fellow at the Institute for Contemporary China Studies. I invite our guests who join us online since the connection is not perfect. And if you want to get engaged in the discussion, please raise your hand and we will pass the microphone to you. But let's start with those present in our studio, and then we will ask our guests joining us online. The question is very simple: on whose side China is in this war? Well, China stands for themselves. They try to pursue their interests during this war. They identify their stance as neutral. It has aftertaste of Russian, because Russia is closer to China in their views, in their aspirations, and in this circle they move. So we should base our stance on that, and every step taken by China, every statement they make is aimed at their comfort, at what they want to achieve and what they pursue. I will add more details. If we're in Orientalist space, the enemy of the enemy is the friend. So the friend of my enemy, who is them? Well, you know, East is a subtle thing, as a famous character used to say. I agree that China pursues their interest, and strategically it does not coincide with the Ukrainian interest, and that's why we see that after 9 years of the so-called hybrid war and 1 year of bloody genocide war by Russian Federation, China stepped up with their position, their stance that they called the peace plan, which mentions Ukraine only in the title. So the political stance of China as to the settlement of Ukrainian crisis, it only says about China and the United States. So this shows what they think about us and their role. But that war is actually not beneficial for China, because it shows all the world that in the 21st century China can be a geopolitical center, and it shows which will be the rules they will offer to the world about sovereignty and territorial integrity. All that stuff is very good, because China only thinks about Taiwan. But in our specific case, the key resolutions of General Assembly of United Nations on territorial integrity of Ukraine, dated 2014, as to the armed aggression against Ukraine, dated 2022, and the fair and just peace based on the Statute of United Nations, dated this year, China abstained on voting. So it clearly indicates whose side they are on and whose interests they pursue. All right, so let's proceed to our experts who are online. Mr. Yuriy, whose side is China on, and how should Ukrainians treat it? I think that I agree mostly with my colleagues that China pursues their national interest, but the situation is such that their interests coincide with the Russian side, actually. So China seriously supports Ukraine because they say about some neutrality or pro-Russian neutrality. In Russia they call it the neutrality friendly to Russia, or neutrality towards Russia. And they had telephone negotiations between Putin and Xi Jinping, and we've never heard about any communication between leaders of Ukraine and China, and it demonstrates clearly that China is not so neutral. So we observe financial support, economic support, technological support, and to some extent military support of Russia by China, which is expressed by supply of electronics, components for radars, aviation, helicopters, and so on and so forth. Is this war of benefit to Russia? There was a serious discussion that there was a statement that it's not of benefit to Russia, but we have contacts with Chinese experts who are close to the Chinese government, and well, they're directly affiliated with the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, so, and they propose a number of discussions between the closed doors. So we came to the conclusions that China will benefit from the victory of Russian Federation. And after 1 year, Chinese economy did not suffer, was not affected by the war, because what happened is only due to the zero tolerance by the Western states. So it's a serious question whether this war is not of benefit to China. And our last guest who joins us online, last but not least important, so whose side is China on? I support my colleagues. Really, China pursues their interest, and this neutrality has some Chinese specifics. And what China does now, they try to recompose the world in compliance with their own imagination, in their own concept. Just like Mr. Oleksandr said, we see how China would approach the international relations, how they build the relations with smaller countries, how they will solve the conflicts, and so on and so forth. And Ukraine for China is a secondary country. It's dependent on the United States from the point of view of China, so there is no need to enter into dialogue with us. And as to the destiny of the country, they are willing to talk more to Russia about it, and to the United States. So they would not communicate with us on par. I would like to ask you to bear with us, but the question is as follows. The current relations between China and Ukraine, how are they? Why don't we have an ambassador so far? And whose fault is that? How to fix this situation? What are the levers of influence who can help us so that we enter into a format of efficient communication, into format of dialogue, efficient dialogue? Is it personal question to me? Well, yes, and then we will go in reverse order. Well, as to the ambassador, this is really a question to our government. They're looking for a candidate which would be convenient to everybody. It's complicated for me to answer this question. As to the relations with China, China maintains the relations with Ukraine on an economic level, which holds us back to a certain extent, because they see us through the prism of their relations with Russian Federation, and making another step closer when entering into some partnership or agreement, they look at Russia and they think whether it will be accepted normally in Moscow. So we can develop our relations with China on private level, but on the intergovernmental level, just until the situation changes radically, until the end of this war, we won't see any significant movements in China's stance towards Ukraine. So let's get back to the guests in our studio. So what should Ukraine do in this situation? Well, first of all, it's war going on in Ukraine, and what's of the most concern to us is how we can achieve peace, stable, sustainable peace. And in this area we work a lot, and the expectations put on China within the last year by our government, well, it's not about transformation, but there were incessant attempts to contact from the very first day and try to influence China and to some extent assuage them. President Zelensky addressed Xi Jinping numerous times to have a direct contact with him, because Zelensky proved himself as a good communicator. He had a number of meetings, and some of the meetings, they changed the attitude of this or that country. Our diplomacy, headed by our president as the main representative of our foreign policy, he made a number of steps, and he thought that China can be talked to. But unfortunately, Chinese both system and their understanding is different. As my colleague mentioned, there was no contact because China is not interested in such contact. This is why we observe certain transformation from those attempts to get China engaged. Just then it transforms into this attitude not to harm, so that China doesn't help Russia more, at least in this situation. Now we're talking about the weapons, and I personally don't see any perspective that China would help Ukraine specifically. Moreover, I see all those gradual steps. First of all, personal competition with the United States. It's in such a serious phase now. The Chinese rhetoric towards United States becomes harsher and harsher, and China uses this Ukrainian card in their struggle with the United States. The latest statements about the weapons, and those statements, they already evolved from like, don't support or Ukraine with weapons because you just kindled that fire of war, and they proceeded to the statement like, you supply Ukraine with weapons and you supply weapons to Taiwan, and why shouldn't we supply Russia with weapons? So all this knot is tightening around Taiwan, and this rhetoric doesn't help us in this situation. Mr. Oleksandr, what can help us to reestablish the dialogue? Well, obviously there should be diplomacy, but I'm skeptical towards any breakthroughs in Chinese direction, and I think we have to realize the limited nature of our capabilities. First and foremost is that China, just like Russia, is in fact an empire. They see small countries as those who have limited sovereignty, and as it says in the Statute of the United Nations that we can get on par relations, that's vain hope. We can influence on China in three ways. I will say three figures: 690 billion, 190 billion, and 18 billion. That's the turnover between United States and China, Russia and China, and Ukraine and China through trade and some positions through commerce. We cannot get them encouraged to change their stance. We can influence China if we can, so only and exclusively through our Western partners, and they actually do it. They warn China if there will be support with weapons, not only chips to Russia. The export of chips increased twice, including through Turkey. I mean, export of chips from China to Russia, Russians already found some way around sanctions. So that's not the way we can influence on China. We can only moralize them. We can talk about it in United Nations. China abstained from voting in 3 resolutions. They blocked the G20 communique, which should have repeated the international stance towards the war. We still have to keep doing it, but I don't agree actually with the position of the president as the communicator, because it's a whole different system. If president is accepted as a person who stands for their freedom and is the embodiment is the epitome of democracy in the post-Russian, post-Soviet space. It's a threat for China. The charisma of President Zelensky against this incomprehensible articulation of Xi Jinping, it's unacceptable. It's a whole different culture. We have no opportunity to reach out to the average Chinese. We understand it's non-democratic country. There is no influence on part of their average Chinese, even if half of their population supports us. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We have to try to break through this Chinese digital wall, Chinese firewall, but we cannot have the average Chinese influence their government. But we have to talk about the future, and depending on how this war ends, I hope it will end with our victory and sustainable peace. And if there is no victory, if there is a ceasefire, just like Chinese offer, that will be a breather for Russians before yet another attack of theirs. If there is any negative scenario, the role of China will increase, because they can sit at the negotiations table about this peace, about the ceasefire. Short and negative for us, but we should do everything we can to win, and then the word of China will not weigh anything in this peaceful regulation. I'm not even talking about security. China is a signatory of so-called Budapest Memorandum, and their role is incomprehensible there, and we appreciate that they warn against use of nuclear weapons, but in all other moments they cannot serve as the guarantor of our security. The only guarantor can be membership in NATO. Mr. Yuri, how desperate is this? What are the prospects of the dialogue? And as Natalya mentioned, what should we do not to make harm, to prevent China from supplying weapons and munitions to Russian Federation? Well, it's difficult to add anything actually to the words of my colleagues. I mostly agree with the statements of my colleagues, but I think that even after the war, the prospects of relations between Ukraine and China are quite limited. We have to understand that if Ukraine tries to become a part of European Union, a part of NATO, Ukraine should undertake certain obligations. We see NATO and the relations of European Union with China, but they see it as a challenge to the security, to the values, to the interests. And the recently signed concept of NATO regarding China, they are very clearly worded that China tries to undermine Western positions. So for Ukraine, it would be clear, if just like Mr. Oleksandr Khara said, Ukraine cannot achieve any security guarantees from China. Ukraine should protect itself, because if China does anything against Ukraine as a part of the West, Ukraine should build the security system that would disable China from influencing Ukrainian national interest. Like the attempts to master Ukrainian military technologies. We've seen a case with Motor Siege. If China would have been able to acquire this business, the threats, the consequences would have been very serious. So I think Ukraine should rethink its relations with China. First of all, with account of long-term national interest, because China wouldn't be a reliable security or economic partner from the point of view of building new economy for Ukraine, because the model we used to have previously, which was based on export of raw materials and so on, it's obsolete. It cannot be continued. If Ukraine is number one in military strength, so we should build a model of economy which would ensure the expenses, which would ensure that we cover our expenses. We cannot be a recipient of foreign financial aid, but we don't see any Chinese investments here. China cannot be a driver in development of economy of Ukraine. So Ukraine should take into account their obligations in front of NATO, and obviously also we should take into account the global ambitions of China and their stance in this war between Russia and Ukraine. And the aspirations of China is to undermine the positions of the West. What they try to promote is this vision that you can capture a territory, you can call it liberation, and so on and so forth. So Ukraine has to see strategically, to reevaluate strategically their relations with China, and to give it a realistic, adequate assessment, and to build a system that would ensure security in terms of Ukrainian national interest. First, screening of foreign investments, which is already implemented in the European Union for long ago, and not admitting Chinese investors in certain sectors of industry in Ukraine. We should cease any military and technical cooperation between Ukraine and China. So there is a number of questions that need to be solved. Ukraine cannot continue supplying China with weapons because China may use them in their operations against Taiwan. Mr. Yuri, you mentioned those 12 items, but I have a very simple question. Why did China emerge with their initiative just now? Why have they been waiting all these years? A good question. I'm trying to answer it in a way closer to reality. So there are two options, two variants that we consider in our analytics center. We try to double check it in a number of ways using our contacts with China. Well, first approach is that the whole world expects for the constructive stance from the China, and they can't wait to see it. And it's a normal work of diplomacy when you expect something from us, so here's our plan. You want the plan, here it is. And the second thing is, we shouldn't say that China did not step up with any initiative. On the very second day after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, China posted 5 items regarding Ukrainian crisis. In a month, Xi Jinping made a statement of the four musts about the so-called Ukrainian crisis. So Chinese diplomacy was talking for a long time. They were expressing their stance, and what they used to say before is in the majority, 90%, it coincides with this 12 items plan. So the first version is that what China used to say, they reiterated the same stance upon the demand of international society, international community, and then China starts promoting diplomatically this document, and Iran, Belarus, Russian Federation, Hungary, and maybe some other countries already expressed their support of this document. So I think that might be some coordinated efforts of Chinese diplomacy for promotion of this initiative. What is the purpose of it? It's very difficult to say so far, but I don't exclude any negative scenarios for Ukraine in this regard. And I would like to have Mr. Dmitro engaged. Is it the smoke curtain in diplomatic terms, or is it a Trojan horse of Russian diplomacy? Or is it a sane, healthy initiative? So a couple of more words about how to influence the position of China. In my opinion, I think China can be influenced by communicating with third countries whose position is important for China. I mean the Asia-Pacific countries, and because those countries are potentially important for China, and China understands that those countries feel the threat to their security from China. So talking to them, that communicating, that to them the message that the Chinese position is pro-Russian and is aimed at change of the world order, and if those countries end up in a case similar to Ukrainian, they would not be helped. So they should pose this question in front of China. They should demand China to express a more clear position. Vietnam. Is Vietnam one of those countries? I think it will be difficult to communicate with Vietnam, but Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, I'm talking first of all about those countries, and maybe some countries of the Southern Asia, like India and countries surrounding it, the neighboring countries. And about your question about the peace plan, I think that it's a part of more, it's a broad strategy of China. We should consider it within the framework of the global strategy that was stated by Xi Jinping, which correlates with the Chinese imagination of the Chinese world order, that it should be harmonious, it should be dialectic, and the weaker countries or younger countries should go with the flow of the stronger countries and to concede to their positions. And China doesn't have any experience in peaceful settlement of any conflicts. They were involved in different situations, but their role was not definitive. It was vague and opaque. What we see now is the same. There is nothing concrete in this plan, and China as mediator, as the country which tries to settle this situation, is not efficient. They don't have enough experience in such processes. Very interesting thought, very interesting opinion, Mr. Oleksandr. So this peace plan is an attempt of China to install themselves in the system of a global security as a country who may influence the processes, because their policy was isolationist before. They were trying to conceal their silk and compass while the wonders were happening in the world. It's not a plan, it's the Chinese position. In fact, what they want to see in Ukraine, that's the main thing, because there is no real plan so far. I would say that Xi Jinping is currently on stretch. They see that their younger junior partner cannot change the situation dramatically, so they consider Russia as the junior partner. Well, obviously, it's not an elder brother. So obviously, Russia depends on China more and more. They sell oil with more discount, I think 10%, and the same story with the gas. I'm not even talking about other things. Well, let's not touch the economy so far. So the stretch is like this. Xi Jinping sees that Russia is unable to win this war, and respectively they should be held, but it would entail some negative consequences in middle term and long term perspective from the world. Or they should help with weapons so that Russia could have killed Ukrainians with the same level of intensity within another year, and the West gets exhausted and stops supporting Ukraine, and Russia somehow ends up in a draw. And a third option is to freeze the situation, because ceasefire in fact would mean that Russia would not stay in the territories occupied before the 24th of February, but on those occupied later, and Russia would stay there. They will not withdraw their troops from there, and on some conditions like neutral status, which are not acceptable to Ukraine, those conditions would be acceptable to China, because they're against NATO, just for a very simple reason, because the United States already created different teams of partners, like this Trans-Pacific Agreement for free trade, and the influence keeps increasing, and China tries to end it on a compromise note, but in fact they promote Russian interest. There are some positive moments from something that China benefits from this war. They can buy Russian energy carriers at discounted price, but first look, the West stands united. The Europeans, except for Orban, they started reducing their dependency on China. They're not interested in all those group formats with China export limitations. Germany is going to refuse Chinese technologies of 5G, but they didn't do it before, and they're quite dependent economically. They were relying on China before. Then we see the new role of NATO. They are preparing to the conflict. We see that the Taiwanese review the plans of how they would defend their independence. I want to remind you that last year and the year before there were unprecedented actions by the Chinese army, their entrance into Taiwanese airspace, for example, and now the government publicly states about their readiness to occupy Taiwan using military power. Well, today is the holiday of democracy. Well, yesterday Xi Jinping once again, for the third time, he became the chairman of China. All those things, they demonstrate that China does not benefit a lot from it. So those relations, tight relations, tense relations with the USA, they provide for some negative background Chinese would like to withdraw from, and the war is an irritator that does not allow them to cool down a little bit and to continue negotiating with United States on a competitive basis. And Xi Jinping, for the first time, like they say since Soviet, that there are some external forces that do something against us, and he called USA, which is something unprecedented for China. It's so explicit to them. So I think that there is a dilemma that China entered into, supporting their junior partner without understanding how they can get China involved in a very difficult situation. And I think that China now loses more than they benefit from this war. Ms. Natalia, the same question: how should we treat this peace plan, and why did it emerge just now? Is it the lack of understanding of situation, or is it poor analytics of the situation, or is it normal Chinese thing and their ability to wait? Well, we were following the rhetorics of China and what China was talking within this year, those general phrases that are related to foreign policy. Well, in my opinion, they accuse China on being on the side of Russia, and they demand the position of the countries in front of which China would not like to look as a country which supports Russia. First of all, I mean the European countries, because apart from United States, European Union is a very important trade partner, more than $700 billion. China worked a lot on creating their image in the European Union to get integrated in some strategic things and to influence in that way on Europe. And they want to divide the European Union and the United States. I'm talking about the period before the war. So using the tactics of Putin and Russia, they used to be a new player in this space, but they were trying to divide the countries of Eastern Europe or Central Europe in 17+1. So they were taking a number of states. So this is the Byzantium style of policy. Yes, exactly. And they had to show those countries that peace plan, I mean this proposition, we've heard for the first time about it in Munich Security Conference. But if we track it, China accused a lot United States, they were the regular Chinese to help, they can be a constructive force. But the effect that they were expecting, it did not happen. European countries already formed their stance about what's going on and understanding of China, that war is war and business is business, trade is trade. They either did not catch this moment, or they were counting on approaching European Union from other side. And we have to understand that for every European country, for the time being, war in Ukraine is about their own security, and they are not ready to segregate business. So yeah, I want to ask now, why did they got back to being silent right now? They threw that ball and they're silent since then. I would not say that they're silent since they announced their plan. I'm seeing that this plan is becoming a Trojan horse, an alternative to peace. Yuri already mentioned the countries that supported it. Kazakhstan was added to list of those countries. And there were voices in the world that called the parties to sit at the table of negotiations because the poor countries suffer, the world economy suffers, and China wants to become the protector of the interests of the global south, that they are the peacemaker. They propose this peace plan unlike the United States. And there was a lot said that specifically the United States, using their methods, they are unselective, they enkindle the wars all around the world, they make trouble for all the world, but we want to live in harmony, which is dialogue. And this plan is unfortunately something that can play a negative role in the regard that, for example, I've read about Egypt today. They say that there are many developing countries in the world that suffer from this war, and everybody is interested in peace. Well, everybody is interested in peace. Ukraine is interested in peace more than anyone else. But when those countries are talking about the peace, they talk about peace at any price so that their economy works, world economy doesn't fall but doesn't crash. But no one says that we want peace and we support Ukrainian aspirations. We want Russian troops to leave Ukrainian territory. So this is when the peace comes with everybody. But that stands like beyond the curtain, because this is the Chinese position to like peace at any cost. We don't propose any mechanisms. Among the proposed mechanisms is do not supply Ukraine with weapons and to lift sanctions from Russia because it impedes world economic processes. And all those injections of information from this or that side, they harm to the resolution of this issue, because things are simple. Russia is aggressor and they have to leave Ukrainian territory, but no one talks about that. They talk about quite different thing, and then we pose a question like, what's behind this proposal, Chinese proposal? And the colleagues mentioned about their own interests already. And it's not about peace for Ukraine. Well, we have questions on the floor, please. Nadia Yurshenko, Ukrinform. I have one question to Mr. Yuri and then to the rest of the experts. Mr. Yuri, you mentioned that China benefits from the victory of Russia. Can you give a couple of arguments in this regard? And it was said that China makes more harsh statements with regard to the weapons, and they are evaluated as their readiness to jeopardizing their relations with China, with the United States. So how far would they go? Because their trade turnover with the United States and European Union is times bigger than with Russia. Will it result in any counteraction? Will it result in something global? Let's start with Mr. Yuri. Thank you very much for this question. Really, it's very difficult task to analyze China, because China is the isolationist political regime and their internal processes, and everything which is related to the decision making and foreign policy, internal policy, political struggle. It's all very sensitive information, and it's very difficult to obtain it. So how we analyze things, we have to have some incoming data. There are methods for analysis. We can analyze this information in a number of ways, and after this methodology we may summarize it and come to some conclusions. If we don't have any entry data, so no matter how we analyze it, we will come to some wrong conclusions, wrong results. This is why the statements of the top level government officials they are maybe insufficient, because China in their strategic communication is manipulative. We hear the statements about the war of Russia in Ukraine and the role of United States, role of the West, and we may have some partial access to information, to analysis of this information that would become a result of our discussions with the defense experts. We see there is a dynamics since it started in May, June, July, then October. We see how their position changed in this process. During the May discussion, for example, Chinese experts, they were not satisfied with the war, but they were not satisfied with the war itself, but that they were dissatisfied that Russia cannot win it. They said, we understand Russian Federation. They were humiliated. They were excluded from global processes. However, that did not happen. They were humiliated by the West, and us as a Chinese, we understand it, and we feel for Russian Federation. We feel sorry for them. So this is how it can be ideologically beneficial for China to have Russia win this war. Another thing, during the discussion in July, we asked the head of the Chinese delegation in the rank of a major general, reserve major general. We asked a couple of scenarios on his opinion in a couple of scenarios. So the victory of Ukraine, victory of Russia, and the ceasefire, or the current condition. So but we didn't get any direct answer. However, the Chinese side said that the chair of Chinese delegation said that all of the three scenarios are of no benefit to us, which means that Ukrainian victory is not beneficial to them either. And when we were continuing our discussion with Chinese side, we were seeing that they take it very negative that Russia can lose this war. And there's a lot more experts. I just don't want to take a lot of your time. And the question was, how far can the Chinese go? How they can step on their throat of their economic son in their aspiration to become a superpower? Well, it's difficult to say. A couple of years ago, Chinese experts were quite optimistic. They were saying we grow 5 to 6% per year, and in 10 years it will be 50%. The world will depend on us. We will become the #1 partner for all the countries, which will mean we will be able to switch off the economies of different countries, because they will be a small fraction of our economy. Meanwhile, we will mean the whole economy to them. But that may not happen if we don't think in a linear way, because it may not happen because United States already discussed those 10 years. They were discussing for 10 years what they should do with China, and they see it as a threat, and they should counteract the threat. They cannot exclude the Chinese economy from global processes, but they may impede them from obtaining key technologies from the West. And my forecast on how far China can go in their economy is still a question. The forecast for economic growth is 5 to 6%, and they can keep growing. but they will not be advanced economy. It will not ensure this opportunity of strategic advantages for China. And as to the provision Russia with weapons, according to our observation, Chinese political management, there is still a discussion on that level whether to give weapons or not to give them to Russia. The last year they were sure that Russia would win, but in the end of the year they were doubting that, and they were thinking that the winter will give a lot of opportunities to Russia because the strikes on energy infrastructure will provide a window of opportunities for Russia, but now they see that Ukrainian armed forces are preparing to counteroffensive, and I think that Chinese experts in the political crowds, they already have the opinion that Russia may lose with a high degree of probability, and for the time being I don't exclude the option that China will make a decision to hand the weapons to Russia on a bigger scale. They can do it through Iran or Belarus, or they can do it gradually, watching the reaction of the West. The reaction of the West is very important from the strategic point of view. I would like to ask for more details. My question about the United States was whether China is ready to risk their economy for the sake of global leadership. Well, global leadership can be evaluated in different ways. Whether China is ready is difficult to say. It's our interpretation of the things. We don't know whether they're ready or not. We don't have access to the negotiations of the top-level government officials of China. This is why it's quite difficult to analyze it. But what we can do, judging by those small indicators, small fractions of information, we can try to verify that information. For the time being, it's difficult to say whether they are ready, but there is a number of aspects. First, the war did not ruin the Russian economy. We don't know what is about to happen this year, but what was forecasted, the 15% fall of Russian economy, the European Union published information that the fall was 3.5%, and it may be a lesson to China that even the sanctions, very serious actions, they may not be so efficient in this regard. And I think that it may reduce the sensitivity of China to provision of some military support to Russian Federation. Another aspect, I seem to have forgotten another aspect. Well, yeah, let's proceed to Mr. Dmytro then. Well, on one hand, China has their war rhetorics, the muscles, the weapons, and on the other hand, billions of lives and sustainable development. So the question is, to what extent people may refuse this normal life for this vague superpower? Well, to answer your question, we already discussed it, that China is building their image of international leader, and it's important for them to be perceived as the peaceful country, the one that takes care of the interest of all the countries of the world. And the image of the country that supports the war doesn't become it. So officially they will not make any steps in that direction, but there is an official direction too. China really needs stable economy. They need to continue with their high pace of economic development, because in part this economic development is provides for the stability of political regime. It lifts this question why we live so bad, why the Communist Party of China guides our country. So sustainable growth and development is very important for them, and it contradicts any crisis in the world, the wars and so on. So they want to get involved in peacemaking process, but China has negative attitude to Russians' loss in this war. And my opinion is that China will support Russia to the extent it would be possible to do it unofficially, because China already concealed a lot of things that were quite difficult to conceal. For example, some schemes of supply of weapons and components through the third countries. So they will keep doing this, but they will abstain from some jeopardization. Okay, so what will be the politics of China? Will they continue sitting in the bushes as a tiger, or will they do it as Russia? Well, they were sitting in the bushes for all these 9 years, and within the last day of hot phase of war. So why is it beneficial for China to have the Russians win? A Chinese journalist asked, why isn't China on the side of the West? And she says, like, do you want us to help you deal with Russia and then you focus your efforts on us? So this is their formula. They need a weaker junior partner which may supply some resources, natural resources, military resources, and political resources. Meanwhile, China deals with this problem. Whether they will help or not, they already do help, and they will do it below the level which would entail some negative consequences. But I have a hypothesis why that they cannot do it like directly to break the situation. It makes Xi Jinping's system similar to Putin's regime. There is a resentment. It's this, if we look back in history, World War II, World War I, they were based on that. On one hand, there is somebody who doesn't let you live normally, some external forces, and on the other hand, you are the most powerful country. It's the same story with Russia. They attacked us because we are a threat to them, but on the other hand, they are so strong. Well, because they were feeling that they can. Yeah, that's the real story, but rhetorically, on the level of conscience, there is a duality. We are being humiliated, but we are a powerful country. And the window of opportunities for Russia, it was a window of opportunity to return us to their orbit, to recompose the European architecture, remove the United States from there. Remember, Kremlin was coming up with the proposals to the West, in fact to the United States, and they had to deliver it to their European allies. NATO had to split. United States had to go away from Eastern Europe to remove their nuclear weapons. So in the same way they divided Germany after World War II. So window of opportunities is quite an important thing. On the other hand, there is indoctrination and the vision of the world through ideology for both China and Russia. The exit of the United States from Afghanistan, that was a ring to them, that this is where they showed like this is our chance to do something. Demographics, it's very actual for Russia, and it's also actual for China too, because they're not the most populated country of the world anymore. It reduces their opportunities to enjoy their economic achievements and to resolve their question with the question with Taiwan. It can be an irritator to them, the alternative China. For example, there is no alternative Russia. Wherever Russians come, they create their Russian peace, Russian world. And there was Hong Kong that was absorbed by China previously, and there is still Taiwan, where people still live in democracy. So it's an irritator that should be eliminated. And on part on geopolitics, the establishment of full control in Taiwan will mean the establishment of full control in Asia, and Europeans and Americans with smaller resources and demographic problems, they will their influence will go to nil in that region. So this is the indoctrinated opinion in Chinese heads that may push them to go against the logic of resolution of their key problems, which are the economy is the problem after COVID, first of all. Secondly, the conditions of export control, they don't have access to the most up-to-date technologies, the chips. Then it's about decoupling, the segregating of Western countries and China. They don't want to depend in terms of critical technologies in rare earth materials, rare earth metals. There is protectionism like in the United States. The China may see that like just until we have all of it, until the situation gets deteriorated, and until United States reduce their dependency on us. We have 690 billion turnover plus the Europeans. It's not the same as with Russia, how they decoupled from Russia. And this question about the global south, this is the position of China, their peace plan. It was not aimed at us, it was aimed as a signal to the Americans, because they mentioned about the mentality of Cold War and sanctions and so on and so forth. It's all about the United States, and the rest is about the global south that supports the repeat Kremlin propaganda, just like, for example, India does. So they should not intervene in this story. They cannot break the course of this war, even if they provide Russia with artillery. The West will give us more and more. Well, it will cost us lives, but they cannot support Russia to the extent that West supports us. So they should press on us and on global south to freeze the conflict under some title for everything good against everything bad, not to let Russia fall, and to support them with something economically, and to consolidate their leadership position among the countries that did not join the anti-Russian coalition. So this is the intermediate way that China is choosing. So we're already on the phase of forecasting. You answered my last question, and I will have yet another question to Ms. Natalya and our guests online. It's a simple question: what should we expect from China within short period? Well, it's a very complicated question, because within the last 20 years at least, they were building their foreign policy with certain degree of forecastability. Now they create some myth regarding themselves, because it's the Xi Jinping's China, and he has ambitions not only about China as a country, but about himself personally. He broke some schemes which were comfortable for the development of the country, which helped China to become the economically powerful, helped it become what it is now. But now Xi Jinping got all the power in his hand. He stays for the third term just as long as he wants. And when we start talking about these aspirations of any authoritarian leader to work for his ambitions, it reduces the ability to forecast. China was trying to maintain stable economical core. They have plans to make the sustainable middle class, to ensure some conditions for their people. And in accordance with this logic, they should value the relations they have with the European Union, with America, the economic relations, and not to risk them. And Xi Jinping is kind of afraid that this economic layer is absent, and it may raise questions to him. So we've seen those fears when this anti-COVID policy, the isolationist policy, worked against Xi Jinping. He didn't intend to ease it in any way. And when people started going out in the streets, it turned out that they can recoil it quite quickly and not to react publicly to it. So yesterday we had COVID, everybody was locked down at home, but tomorrow everything is fine, and in a month, there is no such problem at all. So this is the indicator that shows that Xi Jinping will pay attention to economy, and on the other hand, the logic in regard of Chinese support of Russia is maybe they should play in the middle, sometimes play with the European Union, but they categorically don't want to do this. For example, talking about Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, they could play their role like in accordance to their aspirations, to the items that they stated, to help demilitarize at least one of the, to make one of the steps. China doesn't do it. They don't support the resolution of IAEA that was accepted based on the research made by the international observers. And now what I'm feeling tense about is that on one hand there are some logical aspects that say that China will not get involved, they will not openly help Russia. But another thing that makes me tense is that China is interested in Russian victory, or at least so that Russia doesn't lose, and the supplies of weapons to Taiwan and supplies of weapons to Ukraine, that it transformed into an argument that China may start using to start supplying weapons to Russia. Yes, they have a peace plan on one hand and they like peace. They promote this rhetoric, but we see how they use the methods of misinformation and propaganda and manipulation of facts in the same way that Russia does. And unfortunately now we're facing some unforecasted China, not as forecasted as it used to be. So now they end up in the environment which is not comfortable for it. The active struggle with the United States, and this is how they build their internal world and external world and their attitude, their behavior. Thank you. Mr. Dmitro, where our unforecasted Eastern Tiger will go next? I think that there are some things that are above Xi Jinping. Is the Chinese tradition, the relations between emperor and his people, and the relations with the countries surrounding it. But as I said, this is a part of a Chinese tradition. The Chinese tradition contemplates harmony, stability, and I think that there will be no radical changes to the Chinese position, maybe under the influence of foreign external circumstances. There will be some smaller moves, but generally in a view of public stance of China on this situation, there will be no some drastic changes. Well, and Mr. Yuri, if you're still with us, our last question: what should we expect from China? So BRICS, China, United States, all this global south, how will the cards be laid? Well, I want to say that there is some period of indefinition. We see the negotiations with China, top-level government officials. They say that previously something could be forecasted. We could build our forecast based on some rational indicators within the next 5 years. Is the period that they characterized as the serious crisis that may result in a conflict. So it's difficult to forecast, really, because the arguments that we used for a long time to study the actions of China and to forecast their actions for future, they may not work in future, because somehow we think that China acts rationally, and they have to act rationally. Maybe something will change, but if we see the results of 20th meeting of the Communist Party, we see that they dedicated more attention to the matters of security, a lot more than to the matters of economy. All those statements, phrases dedicated to the world security, national security, we see them 70% more times than in previous document, and more than in previous documents. Well, and their attention to economy reduces, and we can say that how China sees Taiwan, how they see their security, they can pay more attention to the security more than to economy. And talking about their relations with the United States announced sanctions against 5 Chinese companies which were supplying components to Iran for manufacturing of their UAVs. It says that China may not be afraid of sanctions, in fact, but if there are sanctions imposed in relation of those companies never cooperated with American companies. They had no accounts with American banks, so China may be insensitive to sanctions. They may not act in a way they would like to, but if China loses $1 billion or $10 billion, that's a minor thing for China in terms of sanctions, but geopolitically they will not let Russia lose, because even freezing the conflict is a victory, in fact. As they regroup, they announce the territories as theirs, they start reintegration, and they can continue develop their policy in this regard. So what's going to happen next? Their strategic competition with the United States will continue, but the conflict is not so probable. China will try to find communication with the European Union, but the European Union will reevaluate their attitude to China. They see risk, and we witness it on the level of statements, on the level of documents. Europeans think that the strategic deterrence in relation of Russia failed, and it may fail in relation of China, and the economic interdependency doesn't really work. It didn't work in case of Russia, and it may fail in case of China. So this period of instability and reevaluation of communication, it doesn't necessarily result in security. It didn't work with Russia, and it may fail with China. As to the global south, China will try to increase their influence, the dependency of those countries, and for China those countries will be more and more important, because it's a gray zone for China so far. Thank you very much. As the Chinese proverb says, a road of 1,000 li starts with one small step, and we made this small step today to sort out who China is to Ukraine in our war against Russia. So let's wrap up with that. We want to thank our experts for this fruitful discussion, and Media Center will continue its operation on Monday. See you.